Just on our system of governance and those who would tinker with it, we've got to head off a growing move in politics at the moment that will cut directly across our interests, directly across good governance in this country. More and more of our federal politicians are pushing to extend federal parliamentary terms from 3 years to 4 years. They'll tell you this is good for you. This will lead to better government. I mean, who else would make this argument for them? They're saying that they're so talented, so organised, so reliable, that if we could only give them an extra year every time we elect them, they would get more done for us. The current Prime Minister is keen on the idea.
I think that our terms are too short with just 3 years. Our view, long-term policy, and we've put it to the Australian people, is for 4-year terms. But I don't anticipate that happening anytime soon, and I think that's unfortunate.
On the contrary, that's very fortunate indeed. A recent Newspoll survey shows 4-year terms are favoured by the barest of majorities, 51% of Australians, and given this change would need to pass at a referendum, that's nowhere close enough to carry the whole country and at least 4 of the states. Even though Peter Dutton favours this move and even John Howard says it makes sense, voters, wisely, are a bit more sceptical. In fact, it was only back in 1988 that 4-year terms were put to the people in a referendum and it was defeated soundly. About 2/3 of voters rejected it, similar numbers to the Voice referendum. Now, we all know the arguments that get trotted out on this one. Politicians say it encourages them to make longer-term plans, to lift their gaze above the electoral horizon and get worthy policies and plans in place. That's nonsense. Look at the American system with 4-year congressional and presidential terms, elections alternating with state and midterm elections every couple of years, constant electioneering. It's no different here. Just look at how by-elections and state elections interfere with policy choices made by federal governments. The truth is that politicians never lose sight of the electoral imperatives. They're constantly driven by polls and focus groups, and giving them an extra year will hardly improve the outcomes. On this issue, it's the former Prime Minister Tony Abbott who's got it right.
I've always taken the view that if there's a bad government, an election can't come soon enough. And if it's a good government, it shouldn't be scared of an election. So I certainly would not be in favour of any change towards 4-year fixed terms.
Spot on, Tony Abbott. Who could argue with that? I mean, which government in Canberra was so good that we really reckon it should have lasted another year? Voters tossed out John Howard, of course. Then Labor got rid of Kevin Rudd before he lasted 3 years, let alone 4. And the same Labor MPs got rid of Gillard too before 3 years were up. And then voters got rid of Rudd, of course. Tony Abbott too was dumped by his own party inside 3 years. And Malcolm Turnbull, he lost all of the majority in Parliament bar one before his party knifed him. And after winning that miraculous victory, Scott Morrison was tossed aside by voters before he'd been PM for 4 years. So is this Anthony Albanese government so good that you think it shouldn't face the voters next year, but instead last right through into May 2026? I don't think so. The only thing that keeps politicians accountable is elections. It's the only time we get our say, and we shouldn't insulate politicians from that assessment any less than we currently do. 4-year terms have not improved the quality of state governments. On the contrary, there's plenty of evidence to suggest they've gotten worse over recent decades. If we're going to meddle with changes to our political system, there are far more important things to be done, far more beneficial changes to make. We need to shrink the Senate, for starters. 6 senators per state is plenty. 12 leads to chaos and domination by minor parties. We need to get rid of compulsory preferential voting. Optional preferential is the way to go. Why should we be forced to give a preference to candidates we completely oppose? And also, of course, we should get rid of compulsory voting altogether. Why force the disinterested and disengaged to cast a vote? Let's talk about reform that will make our governance better, not just make life easier for our politicians.